All right, folks, it's time for another Bearded Wonder Explains. This time we're looking at characteristics and strategies of the American Civil War. In other words, what was each side after, and generally speaking, how was the war fought? So, when we look at the Civil War, obviously we are talking about the Union, those are the states in blue, and the Confederacy, those are the states in red. You may also notice the four yellow states, those are called border states. They never actually joined the Confederacy. However, they did send units to support both sides, and so there were Kentucky and Missouri regiments that were fighting for the Union as well as for the Confederacy during the Civil War, and they never officially kind of joined one side or the other. As far as big picture, like what are we after or what are the sides after, the goal of the Confederacy is simple. It's to get the Union to stop fighting. After all, they're just trying to leave and start their own country, and they're the ones that are being attacked by the North. Therefore, if the North stops attacking them and lets them do their own thing, then they've got what they want. And so there are some specific ways that they wanted to do that. The first is a generally speaking a defensive posture. In other words, they don't have to actually like kick the Union's butt or invade the North and attack all kinds of things. They just need to get them to leave. They can fight from a defensive posture. Another thing that they can do is to try to get the Northerners so sick of fighting that they quit. There were a significant number of Northerners that kind of sympathized with the South and their perspective and kind of supported them. And the third one is to get international support. So England especially, if England would jump in the conflict and kind of support the South, kind of like the French did during the War for Independence, that would be really fantastic for the Confederacy. That would help them to achieve that goal. As far as the North, their goal is to get the Confederacy to surrender. It's a little bit harder of an objective, right? It's much easier to just get the others last long enough for the other side to quit. The Union actually has to force the other side to quit. And they end up adopting what we call the Anaconda strategy. We'll talk about that later here. But the second one is to capture Richmond. Richmond, Virginia, you can see where the arrow's pointing here, is the capital city of the Confederacy. And if you can capture that, that would be really fantastic for the North. They want to control the rivers there, the Missouri and the Ohio rivers that kind of border the slave states and the free states there in the north. That's the Ohio River, and then also flowing right into the Missouri River, which kind of splits Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana from the rest of the Confederate states. So they want to control the rivers there. And they also want a blockade, basically something to stop the Southerners from trading. And that's kind of the three components or the three parts, if you will, of the Anaconda strategy. And so that's generally speaking what each side was after. Like we said, the Confederacy has a much easier go of it, given the fact that they don't really have to get a lot done. Now, when we're talking about the Civil War, there are three kind of areas that we need to talk about, and they're kind of defined by our Anaconda strategy. So we have the Eastern Theater, that's the Army of Northern Virginia versus the Army of the Potomac. And that's generally what you speak of when you're learning in, probably elementary school, Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant. That's where they're fighting. That's what most people pay attention to. When we look a little bit closer at that, we can see that the Eastern Theater here is basically defined by the capital cities of the two countries or belligerents. You've got Washington, D.C., which is the northern capital, and you've got Richmond, Virginia, which is the southern capital, and you'll notice that they're not very far apart. And so the Eastern Theater really ends up being kind of like, how can I take the other country's capital city? And eventually in 1865, the North does capture Richmond, but for most of the war, actually, nobody succeeds in that. They kind of fight around these two areas. However, that's not the only place that fighting is happening. There is what we call the Western Theater as well. That's out here by our arrow. that we're looking at, and so let's have a closer look at that real quick. The Western Theater kind of has a couple of goals. So you've got the Ohio River, like we said, there on the north, flowing into the Mississippi River. The North wants to control that to stop the Confederates from kind of invading there into Illinois, Indiana, those kind of places. They also want to control the Mississippi River, New Orleans obviously being at the southern tip of that, but the goal here is to kind of cut off certain states of the Confederacy from the others. And finally, once we control those rivers, the goal of the Union Army is to cut the Deep South off from Virginia. Virginia being in the top right-hand corner there. And so that's kind of the strategy for that. They want to kind of head to the beach after they go ahead and do a hard month or year's work. So that's our Western Theater. Finally, we've got the blockade. Pretty straightforward, not really a whole lot to look at there. It's just put ships around major ports like Charleston and New Orleans to stop the Confederates from getting aid from other places. So that's kind of a high level. That's the way the Civil War works, or the objectives of each side. Let's take just a moment to look at tactics of the Civil War. In other words, how the fighting actually occurred. So the number one tactic, or the number one goal in 1860s, is to get to the high ground. You want to be on the top of a hill. You do not want to be on the bottom of a hill. So if you're sitting on the top of a hill with a gun, you are a happy camper. And if you are not on the top of the hill, if you're down here at the bottom, you are not very happy about that. I don't like, generally speaking, walking up hills, even when all I'm doing is just trying to get from point A to point B. Imagine trying to do it while people shoot at you, and you can quickly and not require a whole lot of imagination to kind of understand, yeah, there's an advantage being up there on the top. The next one is to kind of get cover if you can. And so soldiers actually spent a long time with a shovel, longer than they spent holding a gun. And so if you got on the battlefield first and you could spend 3 hours digging yourself a nice little hole to kind of sit in, that was obviously a lot better than not. Or if you could get behind a fence, if you could get behind a stone wall, that would be ideal. But that's kind of what you're after. The thing you don't want to do is, after your opponent has spent 5 hours digging a ditch and hiding behind a fence, you don't want to be the one that has to run across the open field to get there. That's a bad kind of situation for your goals at long-term survival. And one of the reasons why is because of technology. By the time we get to the Civil War, there's a new technology called rifling. Rifling basically works the same way that a concept would work throwing a spiral in football. It spins the bullet as the bullet comes out of the muzzle of the gun, and rifling basically gets you more distance and more accuracy. Think about throwing that football. You get a tight spiral, it goes further, and it goes where you're aiming it. You can imagine, again, not taking a whole lot of imagination here to figure out why that would be an advantage in a war. However, guns at that time were mostly breech loading, which means that you had one shot at a time, and it took you about 20 seconds to reset, and that's if you were well trained. And so basically, the reality is that most battlefields in the Civil War kind of came down to a bayonet charge. If you can only shoot every 20 seconds and the other guy can run at you and stab you with a big long knife on the end of his gun while you're still reloading, at some point having the knife at the gunfight is actually an advantage in the Civil War because we do not have repeating weapons yet. And the third one is that rifling was also being applied to cannon and other artillery, and so they also had more distance and way more accuracy than they had ever had. If you were shooting at something long range with a cannon, even 50 years earlier, good luck hitting it if it wasn't really close to you. But by the time we get to the Civil War, these cannons, they could hit stuff at 2 miles pretty accurately, which is kind of a big deal. It's going to be kind of a game changer in the way the war is fought. Finally, when we look at kind of the different situations of these two sides, you'll notice that the economies are going to play a big factor as well. The Union has a much higher population, so that means more soldiers, right? You also don't have to worry about trying to keep a large portion of your population enslaved. One of the things that the Southerners always had to worry about, although it never came around, was a slave insurrection. So if we send all the young men off to fight, who's going to stop all the enslaved people from rising up and trying to fight for their own freedom? The Union was kind of hoping that would happen. It didn't. But even though they had more people, they were also heavily industrialized, which means that they could make war supplies a lot easier in their factories. They could also use their railroads to get those materials to where they needed to get. The South had cotton. That's right. It's that cotton thing again, and they had cotton. The problem is that there's not really a whole lot that you can do with cotton. The South was kind of counting on the British supporting them because of that cotton. The British were using the cotton in their factories in England to create cloth. The problem was that England had just kind of developed a new interest in India and was growing cotton there. India was a colony of Great Britain at the time. And so they really didn't need the Southern cotton as much as the Southerners were hoping that they would. And so it kind of left them stuck. So that's kind of how that broke out. And we have the economy of the North, and we have the objective of the South. So if we look at kind of the major strengths of each side, or another way to look at it would be the major weaknesses, the Union has a huge advantage in the economy. They're able to produce war materials, bullets, guns, uniforms, tents, shoes, all of those kind of things. They're able to produce much easier than the South. The Confederacy has the advantage in the objective. They just have to last long enough for the North to quit. And so that's kind of their strength as well. So that kind of sets up the overall situation of the Civil War. Next couple videos, we'll talk about the actual fighting. Thanks for watching. Hope you have a great day.